Thank you, Mike. I'm very flattered. I'm also very delighted to see so many people here. Thank you very much for coming out, both to hear what we have to say, me and the postgraduate students whose posters are arrayed around, and to talk to us, and to allow us to talk to you. As Mike said, this is a conversation. I think this is the first step of what will hopefully continue. What I want to do with the slot that I've got is to give you a snapshot of some of the research that has been going on at Durham over really about the last 10 years or so. I'll talk about why earthquakes are such a grand challenge, and I'll talk about why we're choosing to focus in particular in Nepal, and then what we're doing about that. But I want to acknowledge, first of all, the other people who are involved in this work. This is not something that one person could do. You'll recognize some of the names on here. Nick Rosser is currently an associate professor in the department, or a reader, as we used to be called. He's led a lot of this work. Katie Oven is a researcher co-investigator on some of the work that you're going to see, and I'll highlight the things that she's been particularly involved in. She's sitting at the back. Tom Robinson and Mark Kinsey are postdoctoral fellows in the department. Jack Williams has just finished his PhD in the department as well. And we've worked for a number of years with a particular Nepali organization, the National Society for Earthquake Technology, based in Kathmandu, led by Ahmad Mani Dixit. Some of you will have met Ahmad during field trips to Nepal, and also Gopi Bazial, who's currently a PhD student in the department, working on some of the things that I'll talk about, and Sujan Adhikari as well. So, earthquakes. They're expensive. Big earthquakes cost tens, sometimes hundreds of billions of dollars. They're among the most expensive natural disasters that we face, and the losses from earthquakes are almost always nearly entirely uninsured, especially in emerging economies. They also kill a large number of people. The numbers on this are fuzzy, but something like 2 or 2.5 million people have died in earthquakes over the last 115 years or so. Not all of those, in fact, a surprisingly small fraction of those have died in the really large earthquakes, the big, high magnitude 8 and 9 earthquakes that we hear about in places like Sumatra, Chile, and Japan. Those are those blue bars here, and that's that blue cumulative tally over the course of the last 120 years. Most of the people who die in earthquakes, maybe 2/3 of the people who die in relatively small events, but they're events which happen in the continents. That's what makes them distinct. They happen in the continental interiors, away from the big plate boundary subduction zones that we all hear a lot about. And the reasons for that, I think, are fairly straightforward. Continental earthquakes are more deadly because, in part, they're distributed in space over broad zones. That makes them very difficult for us to anticipate. It makes it very difficult for us to identify the places that are susceptible. This map gives a good indication of that. These are earthquakes that occurred over 1964 to 2004, magnitude 4 and up, in parts of South Asia and the Indian Ocean. And you can see that along the plate boundaries, there's a really dense concentration of earthquakes out here in the mid-ocean ridges, along the subduction zones off the coast of Java and Sumatra. We know where these earthquakes happen. We can anticipate them. We can build for them. We can prepare for them. But then there's this big cluster of earthquakes that don't seem to follow nearly as much of a pattern. They're spread out in space. They're distributed across the continental plate boundaries. And these are much harder for us to prepare for. The faults on which those earthquakes happen are often hidden. Often we don't know there's a fault until it ruptures, or if it has been recognized, it's poorly mapped and poorly understood. The earthquakes on these faults tend to occur over long periods of time, so the recurrence intervals between these may be thousands or even tens of thousands of years. That makes it very difficult to build up any kind of cultural memory or cultural awareness of earthquakes as a hazard. And, most simply, they're close to where we live. We don't live near the mid-ocean ridges, most of us, unless you're in Iceland. So they tend to happen where people are exposed. Now, that's not to say that earthquakes, we have no idea how to deal with earthquakes, and there are some fantastic success stories, and I think some success stories that we as geographers could perhaps make more of. And this is one of them. I mean, the Japan earthquake in 2011, as devastating as it was an enormous event. It was a magnitude 9. It was the 4th largest historical earthquake that's ever been recorded on the globe. And yet, when you look at the size of the population that was exposed to the really intense shaking, the death rate was surprisingly small. The Japanese were prepared for an earthquake of this magnitude. What they weren't prepared for was the tsunami that accompanied it. And most of the deaths from the earthquake came from the tsunami. But the actual earthquake itself was fantastically well mitigated. But that's obviously not the case in every event, and there are some pretty horrifying examples. This is one that's actually motivated a number of us to get into this field in the first place. This is the Bam earthquake in Iran in 2003. Relatively small earthquake, 6.6. Thousands of times smaller than the previous one, and yet it killed something like 30% of the people who were exposed to that really high intensity shaking. So this is the challenge, and in order to address this, more and more organizations have been calling for better use of science, better use of the knowledge that the people in this room hold about this kind of hazard in order to deal with it, in order to reduce our exposure, to reduce the risk, to mitigate this hazard in some way. And here are a couple of quotes. The UNISDR scientific enterprise is vitally important for the development of policy at the highest levels of government and providing evidence of the benefits which ensue from investing in disaster risk reduction. There's a general recognition that science has to be useful, it has to be usable, in other words, it has to be accessible to the people who need it, and it has to be used. Otherwise, what's the point? But none of those calls really explain what it is that we're meant to be doing with this scientific knowledge. What kind of science do we actually need? And what kind of knowledge is important for this sort of activity? And how can we do this most effectively? How can we harness this scientific understanding that we have and are developing about earthquakes to prevent events like the Bam earthquake from occurring? And that's really what this talk is about, and what a lot of this research that I'm going to be telling you is focused on. So, why Nepal? Why are we interested in particular in Nepal? There's a long history of engagement and work in Nepal from Durham Geography, going back, as far as I'm aware, to the late 1990s, possibly even earlier. That's work at the national level, so dealing with governments and with organizations that are working across the country, but it's also dealing with communities and working with individual communities that are exposed to hazards. Nepal is in the unfortunate position of being subjected to pretty much every geological hazard you can think about, with the exception of volcanoes. There are repeated large earthquakes, 1505, 1833, 1934, most recently in 2015, as we saw just recently. It also suffers from persistent and widespread disruption due to the South Asian monsoon, which is an annual occurrence. Most notably, that triggers large numbers of landslides, which disrupt the landscape and the infrastructure. Nepal is also difficult but challenging in the same way that hazards in many ways are everyone's responsibility. Most of the population is exposed in some way, but they're also nobody's responsibility. The governance structure in Nepal, a relatively weak central government, and no clear line or chain of responsibility. Hazards are something that tends to fall through the cracks. And so the responsibilities of knowing about landslides, of knowing about earthquakes, of dealing with these aren't clearly and centrally managed. And in part because of that, there's a large presence of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, both national and international. And that's a double-edged sword. There's a chance, by working with some of those organizations, to have very broad impacts across the country. There are some questions about the capacity of those organizations to both use and incorporate science into their activity, as you'll see in a bit. Okay, so historical earthquakes. Here's Nepal. There's a map of Nepal and India, Tibetan Plateau on the northern part. The arrows here are showing the relative movement of the Indian plate with respect to the stable Eurasian plate, about 35 millimeters per year. That doesn't happen continuously. It happens in large earthquakes. And those earthquakes tend to focus, not entirely, but mostly along this red line here, which is the surface trace of the main Himalayan detachment, the main fault that accommodates this relative plate motion. And the ellipses here show the areas of that fault which ruptured in these large historical earthquakes. The biggest of those being a magnitude 8.4-ish that occurred in 1505 and that devastated much of western and central Nepal. The 1934 earthquake was the last very large earthquake to occur in eastern Nepal. It devastated large parts of Kathmandu. And I'll get to the 2015 in a moment. That's the fault, or at least that's one strand of the fault. That's a part of the Himalayan frontal fault in western Nepal, separating two blocks of sedimentary rock. It's not quite that simple, but that's a large portion of that 35 millimeters per year is taken up across that structure. So that's the villain in many ways. What about landslides? Well, landsliding occurs across the country. It's pervasive, it's diffuse. There are typically on the order of a couple of hundred deaths due to landsliding per year. Almost all of those occur during the monsoon. Because they're diffuse, it's very impractical to engineer against them. It's essentially impossible to predict them. They occur due to rainfall, but they also can be triggered by earthquakes. There's been a lot of work done on the role of road construction in triggering landslides. But they follow a fairly predictable pattern in terms of timing. I'll show you this in a moment. And they have these persistent impacts that I mentioned before. Many roads in the rural parts of Nepal are simply abandoned over the course of the monsoon season and then recut to enable access to some of the mountain communities after the monsoon ends, because there's simply no point in continuing to keep up with all the deformation. So this is an example. This is the Jury landslide. Some of you may have heard of this. This occurred in 2014, resulted in the very hurried reorganization of a department field trip, which was meant to be going to a point upstream of this and therefore inaccessible. And it regularly cuts this road, which you can see running across the middle of the slide. That's one of the two main highways that connects Nepal and China. So most of the goods that travel between China and Kathmandu have to follow along that road. Landslides correlate really nicely with precipitation. That's not too surprising. This is work by Dave Petley, who some of you may remember in the department. This is numbers of landslides that occur per 1,000 square kilometers. And the hot spots in that map really nicely against the hot spots in mean annual precipitation. And like I said, they occur at fairly predictable times of year as well. This is a summary of a number of years of data. Here's the 1st of January, the 31st of December. Most of the landslides occur after the typical onset of the monsoon, right around the latter part of June. So we know something about the hazard. And there are lots of maps that try to express that. These are two examples of state-of-the-art landslide hazard maps, susceptibility maps. This one is on the top is landsliding due to precipitation. This one is due to landsliding due to earthquakes. These were prepared by the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center a few years ago as part of a large nationwide risk assessment. How much of this science is actually being used, though, for risk reduction? How much is actually being taken up and incorporated into the activities of the organizations that are working in Nepal, both governmental and non-governmental? It turns out that question hadn't really been asked. And so work that Katie Oven led asked the question, what's actually being done? What science is being used, first of all? So what scientific knowledge is informing what we do about earthquakes? What science needs to be done or needs to be made available so that it could make a difference? And what are the opportunities and the barriers that are associated with that? So we talked to a range of different people, Nepali scientists, people working for various NGOs as practitioners, people working for donor organizations, and also government officials, just to explore some of these questions. And the results were, for me as a physical scientist, and Mike alluded to my background in geology, they were eye-opening, and I think give us pause for thinking about what we do. Earthquake science in Nepal, in general, is used in really, really limited ways. It's used politically to get risk reduction onto the agenda of governments. It's used to raise awareness of earthquakes in a very generic sense at the community level, but that doesn't require knowledge of detailed recurrence intervals or slip patches on faults. This is very, very high-level scientific stuff that's being used. In-depth technical understanding is seen as not relevant. Hazard maps, the kinds of things that we think of as our kind of bread and butter outputs, physical science. What are the probabilities that a particular event will happen? Aren't used. They're seen as being too difficult for non-technical experts to interpret. They lack detail. They're really useful only for advocacy. In other words, look at all the red areas. Something has to be done. But the detail, why that's red and why that's yellow, or whether that distinction is even meaningless, actually doesn't really factor. So what do donors, what do practitioners want to know? Well, they want to know where and when the next earthquake will happen. And that's not possible. We can't predict earthquakes. So that conversation tends to be relatively short. So you say, okay, well, what else could help? Well, facts, state-of-the-art facts. What are the probabilities? When the next earthquake happens, how big could it be? What's the area that it could affect? What are the numbers of people who could be impacted? How many tents do we need to stockpile? Landslides came up again and again. What's going to happen? We know that landslides will be triggered. Will they cover the whole country? Will they just affect the foothills? Will they affect this road? Will they affect that road? Practitioners want information at the finest possible scale, down to the community level. Again, that's something that's really difficult for us to do as physical scientists. And they wanted examples of how to integrate science into disaster risk reduction plans. And we said, well, that's exactly what we want to know as well. So it's still not relatively clear. So how do we build on that? Well, we went to the communities, and we started talking to communities. And again, this is work that was led by Katie. How can science actually support communities to deal with these large, rare, potentially catastrophic events that, let's be frank, are generally not a priority concern? So what does science actually have to offer in those situations? And the kind of high-level message from the work that Katie and her colleagues did is that it's really not helpful to talk about high-magnitude, large events. Okay? Framing earthquake hazard around these big, catastrophic events is disempowering. It's easy to simply say, well, there's nothing I can do. But there are other ways of approaching the problem, and there are other entry points. And in particular, landslides emerge from much of the work and in many of the communities where we've talked to as an entry point. They're a way to get a conversation started. There's a lot of expertise in Nepal around landslides. There's a lot of knowledge around landslides. There's a lot of practical application, practical mitigation that goes on. That's useful because it allows you to start a dialogue. It has limits, though, and we have to recognize those limits. Many communities don't have the experience of a really catastrophic event, and so that conversation can only go so far. Another key output to come from this is that people are really unlikely to increase their resilience if it decreases their well-being or if it compromises their resilience to everyday risks. the sorts of things that they have to deal with on a daily basis. And that's something that I think is really, really critical for us to keep in mind always when we talk about these sorts of issues. But there are some specific ways in which science has something to say at community level. Small-scale decision-making, microzonation, particular choices around the siting of key infrastructure, for example. Demonstrating similarities or demonstrating the pros and cons of different approaches to hazard assessment. A common question is, why can't we have an expensive piece of equipment here? And often, for many of these problems, a stake and a tape measure is just as useful as an expensive data recorder or data logger. But that's the kind of thing that needs to be done. It needs to be demonstrated. Supporting and really reinforcing some of this local knowledge, giving people the credibility and the support to almost to believe what they already know about the hazards that they face. And then advocacy for local governments, getting government at all levels, but particularly at the district and the VDC level in Nepal, to pay attention to the problem. So this is an example of one of these local efforts. This is a community disaster management committee in a community that sits on the edge of a very large and recurrently active bedrock landslide. There have been various attempts to manage this. There's a lot of community willingness to engage with it, but it's a problem that's really beyond the scale of the community to deal with. And so, but it gives us an entry point to begin to talk about what can actually be done in this case. Okay, so just to wrap this up, there's not much use of science. That's should be sobering to us as scientists. For earthquake risk reduction, hazard maps, not really relevant. Landslides are key unknown, but there are some key things that can be done with scientific information, both at the national and the community level. The problem is that all this takes time, and it takes trust. It takes trust built up between the science community and between the end users of that science. So that's a complex relationship. Enter then an earthquake. And in the midst of our work in Nepal, on the 25th of April, 2015, the Gorkha earthquake occurred. And I just want to reflect a little bit on what the impacts of that were and how that's affected the research that we've done, but how we think we've been able to make a contribution to our understanding of it. So this is a similar plot to what I showed you before. Here again, a simpler version is the Himalayan frontal detachment, this big fault that takes up the relative motion between India and Eurasia. This is the area that was affected by the 1505 earthquake again. 1934 was over here. The 2015 earthquake sat right in the middle. It was relatively small by Nepali standards, magnitude 7.8, which is still pretty big. This is a slightly more detailed map of that. The star here is the epicenter, so that's where the earthquake actually began. But the patch that actually slipped is shown by these colors. This is a map produced by the U.S. Geological Survey. So the colors here show you how much slip there was between the two sides of the fault, up to about 4 meters at a maximum. And you can see right away, the epicenter is off here on the edge of that slip patch. Most of the slip actually happened north and especially northeast of Kathmandu. And that turns out to be really important for the impacts of the earthquake. Most of the slip was happening here. That means most of the energy was being released in those places. And so most of the impacts occurred in those places as well. There's a tendency after earthquakes to focus on the epicenter. It's very quick to identify. This is done automatically within a matter of a few minutes. The epicentral location is known. That map of slip takes longer to produce. And so much of the initial attention and much of the initial aid flowed to the area around the epicenter. Well, not a whole lot happened there. There was damage, but it wasn't nearly as severe as in some of the mountain districts further north and to the northeast. And most of the damage that took place in those districts happened as a result of landsliding. And this is an example of some of the landslides that were triggered in that earthquake. I'll just show you a couple of slides of what those impacts looked like. This is the town of Chaku, near where the Nepal Departmental Nepal field trip spends some time. You can see a lot of sediment in the river down here flowing away from the camera that was delivered directly into the river by some of these Coseismic landslides. And in some cases, those landslides have some pretty substantial impacts on the local infrastructure and population. Now, the Nepal earthquake was an interesting one because in many ways this is the first earthquake that happened with at a time when we have a lot of tools available at our disposal to spread information very quickly. And there were a number of efforts that sprang up in the immediate aftermath of the Nepal earthquake. I would expect that these will happen even to an even greater degree after future earthquakes, to assess the damage and in many ways to crowdsource the scientific information. So organizations like Kathmandu Learning Labs and Digital Globe through this portal called Tomnon made imagery available. People could go, they could download, if you go to a website, they could download the imagery or view it in a browser. They could click on things that looked like they'd been damaged, or they could click on things that looked like they might be landslides, and very quickly build up a picture of what the impacts of the earthquake might be. It's a fantastic idea. Unfortunately, in this particular example, it wasn't used at all for the response. And despite all of these efforts that were going on, there really wasn't much impact of this work, this crowdsourced science, on the response and the recovery that were being led by the UN and by other international organizations. And there are some reasons for that, and that might be something that we can discuss later on. Partly as a result of that, we partnered with the British Geological Survey, and this is work that was led by Nick Rosser, to try to map the landslides and to try to understand what the surface impacts of the earthquake had been in order to help guide the humanitarian response and support it as much as we could by identifying areas that had been particularly hard hit, by identifying roads that had been cut off, etc. And this was really helped by the fact that we already had those relationships. We didn't have to go and find a contact in the UN. We didn't have to find a contact in DFID. We didn't have to find a contact in the World Food Program or in Save the Children. Some of those relationships, in many cases, were already in place. The immediate aftermath of a large earthquake is not the time to be on the phone or on email trying to find the person who can actually interact with. But it was still complicated. The decision makers change in a disaster response. The same person isn't necessarily involved from a given institution. Scientists don't know what humanitarians need to know. The humanitarians often don't know what the science can say or who they should be talking to. And in some cases, if the science isn't in agreement, which one is right? Which one do I use? So, Durham, a number of people at Durham in the department got together, tried to assemble as much imagery as possible, tried to come up with some sensible ways of taking it in, and were able, within about 8 days, to produce this preliminary map of landslides triggered by the earthquake. So, this is a portion of Nepal. You can see the key there at the upper part of the slide. Kathmandu is just there. And these dots here show major landslides that we could see on the images. This is that highway that I've mentioned going between Kathmandu and the Chinese border, one of the two. And then the orange line essentially shows the boundary of where we thought most of the impacts had occurred. So most of the really pervasive impacts had happened north of that line. The red lines here are places where we thought there were a lot of impacts, valleys that looked like they had been pretty badly affected, but the imagery just wasn't good enough yet within this short period of time to identify particular individual landslides. This is about as good as we could get on a time scale of about a week. By the end of June, we were able to put a lot more data together. The clouds had parted over many parts of the Himalayas, We were able to put together a map that looked like this. And now this is colored in terms of the landslide intensity, the number of landslides per square kilometer. So rather than identifying each individual one on this map, this simply shows hotspots. What are the areas like Sindapalchuk, Rashua, and Dolika districts where there are a lot of landslides, and what are the areas that actually, like the foothills, where actually there weren't very many at all? That's great, right? It was a real team effort, but it takes time. That's 2 months after the earthquake. The UN requires an initial situation analysis within 72 hours and a rapid assessment, which then guides much of the response and the recovery effort within 2 weeks. It's very, very, very difficult to assemble that much scientific information in such a short period of time. I'm talking about weeks to months, even with a relatively large team of people working on it. So that was a real learning point for us. Despite that, the maps that the department was able to produce were used by a number of different organizations. There's a list here in various ways, sometimes advocacy, sometimes planning access to particular communities, sometimes for health and safety, risk assessments for staff who were going out into the field and visiting some of these communities. One of the really, I think, important distinctions was that there were landslides and there were landslides. And a lot of the partner organizations that we work with tend to think of landslides as being landslides. They're all the same. But we know as geographers that's not the case. And in this particular earthquake, there was a really important distinction between landslides which happened high up on the hillsides, high in the landscape, and really left landslide debris that was sequestered on the hillsides, not really in a channel, not really easily entrained. And that material tends to stick around. It sits there in the landscape, potentially for hundreds or even thousands of years. Distinction between that kind of landslide and this kind of landslide, where the debris was delivered directly into a channel and was able to be remobilized. Now remember, this earthquake happened 2 months before the monsoon. So as soon as the monsoon rains came, it started to flow, water started to flow through many of these channels. Much of that landslide debris was remobilized. It was picked up and it was moved downstream in a set of debris flows. Now, these aren't predictable in terms of their occurrence, but they're predictable in terms of their location. And in some cases, they could have really catastrophic effects. And recognizing that distinction and recognizing the potentially recurrent and persistent threat posed by this kind of geological process, geomorphological process, I think was one of the key outcomes of this work. So, lessons from this. It's hard to move fast enough to support a humanitarian response in the aftermath of a big earthquake like this. It's possible, but it needs those relationships and that trust to be in place beforehand. The different landslide types were really important, I think, for understanding the persistence of the hazard. And location matters. And I put this slide in because this isn't just about building better buildings. That was a great building. It was just in the wrong place. It survived the earthquake. It didn't collapse. It was well built. But it was sitting close enough to a debris flow channel on a debris flow fan that within a couple of months after the earthquake, it was inundated by this material which had been washed down. So geography matters. Geography has an important role to play in this kind of thing. It's not just an engineering problem, in other words. Okay. Just to wrap up, what have we done since the earthquake? How can science be used in the recovery, and how can we start to think about what to do next time? How can we prepare for the next event? One of the other things that the department, researchers in the department have been able to do is to work with the National Reconstruction Authority, the government body that's been set up to oversee the reconstruction of these hundreds of communities that were damaged, to develop tools for assessing the landslide hazard. There is no landslide hazard, I should be careful what I say. There's no landslide inventory of Nepal. There are many landslide hazard assessments, But those, as I said before, those really aren't used at anything like a local level. And so this was an effort by the NRA to go into affected communities and really try to understand what their exposure was. And so we were able to feed into the information that needed to be gathered, the ways in which that information could be incorporated into their planning. The other thing that's happened is Nick Rosser and PhD student Jack Williams worked with NSET, the National Society for Earthquake Technology, with some of the local communities to install some monitoring equipment, relatively low tech, but monitoring equipment nonetheless, to look at networks of cracks that developed across large areas that were affected by the earthquake. And you can go to the website, it's hosted on our Durham webpage, and see the live landslide data, or at least you can when the mobile network is functioning and the data loggers can actually stream the data. But they're measuring the distance across those cracks, the precipitation, the temperature, in order to try to understand how that's going to evolve and whether these are a persistent threat that people need to plan for. And then what about preparedness? What can we do for the next earthquake? There will be another great earthquake in Nepal. We know that. So what do we do about it? In many parts of the world, in some parts of the world, you answer that question through some sort of probabilistic analysis. You say, where have earthquakes occurred in the past? What are the probabilities that those earthquakes will occur again in the future? And then you plan on that basis. This has worked really well in California. It's worked really well in Japan, New Zealand. There are a handful of places around the globe where we have enough information on the hazard to make sense of that. Nepal is not one of those places, unfortunately. So we've been trying to come up with some alternative ways of dealing with this problem. And Tom Robinson is really the person who's led this. He's a research fellow in the department. And he's really led this use of scenarios, earthquake scenarios. What could happen in an event? And how can we use that as the basis for contingency planning? We know where earthquakes have occurred in the past in Nepal. I mentioned 1505. There was a large earthquake in central Nepal in 1255. A big one in the east in about 1100 or so. But we don't know how frequently they recur. The record doesn't go back far enough. We know there are other smaller earthquakes. 2015 was one. There was a small earthquake in the northeast part of the country in 2011. But again, we don't know the recurrence. We don't have a long enough record. So rather than applying a probability to these, the approach that Tom and others in the department have developed is to say, let's assume that they're all possible. In other words, let's weight them all equally. We know where earthquakes are plausible because we know where the faults are, but we don't know which is the next one to go. So if we base a scenario on a single fault, then we're saying implicitly that fault is going to be the most likely. We simply can't do that. So let's assume that they're all equally likely. So we can say, well, the next earthquake might be here, it might be here, it might be here, here, here. And then we can build up a suite, in other words, of potential earthquake types. Turns out there's about 30 that cover the gamut. Those cover the range of different potential seismic events, seismic sources. Well, those could occur at different times. Earthquakes on weekdays have very different impacts. We know this already from earthquakes on weekends or earthquakes that occur at night when people tend to be in their homes. So that's 30 possible earthquakes, 3 different occurrence times. That's 90 scenarios. It's a large number, but it's not unworkable. So we can take the shaking in those potential earthquakes and combine it with what we know about the distribution of buildings across Nepal of different types, adobe, bamboo, stone, etc. We can combine that with the likelihood that those buildings will be damaged in shaking of a given intensity and the numbers of people who are likely to be in those buildings. And what this gives us then is a suite of possible outcomes, of possible impacts. And in particular, the thing that's most relevant here, estimates of the possible numbers of casualties in each of those 90 earthquakes. Now, again, any one of those scenarios by itself is meaningless, but the suite starts to give us some ideas of what we should expect. So when you look at all of these and you look at the percentage of all those scenarios that cause fatalities, eastern Nepal is not immune from earthquakes, but it comes off relatively lightly. In other words, there are a number of possible earthquakes in Nepal that really won't affect the eastern part of the country at all. Kathmandu is always affected, and parts of the central and western districts are always affected, or nearly always affected. So those become a priority. If you want to prepare for earthquakes, those are the areas where you need to make sure you have sufficient material or sufficient preparation. We can look at maximum fatalities, the number, the percentage of the population which can be affected. And again, parts of eastern Nepal are relatively, compared to other parts of the country, relatively less affected. And we can also look at the variability. So how much variation is there between the different scenarios? How certain, in other words, are we about these sorts of estimates? Right. Just to wrap this up, a few reflections. I didn't put conclusions on here because I don't think we can conclude that this is finished, but I think there are some things that we've learned as a department and as a group. And one of those is again, to me, really striking. The traditional outputs from earthquake science, at least in Nepal, really aren't being used. And I think there's an onus on us as earthquake scientists to start this dialogue and to actually be talking about outputs that might be useful, or might be more useful. There are some important roles for science at the national level, at the community level. We've talked a little bit about these. I talked a little bit about how it's hard to generate useful scientific information in the immediate aftermath of a large earthquake, but it's possible. We've explored some of the constraints on that. A key one, I think, is some simple science could actually go a long way. And in particular, some of the damage to infrastructure that we saw, not just in Nepal, but also in the Wenchuan earthquake in 2008, the Kashmir earthquake 2005, the Chi-Chi earthquake in 1999. There's a pattern developing. Some of the damage could have been prevented with a little bit more science in the planning. Locations of buildings, building outside of debris flow channels, building away from debris flow fans. All of these are geographically relatively straightforward. I think it's time that we started putting these lessons into practice. But again, all this takes time, and sustained engagement is critical. These landslides are going to persist for decades. They're not going away. So this heightened rate of landslide activity is still there in Nepal, 3 years on, almost 3 years on, and it will continue to persist. And we need to be there. We need to be able to monitor that. And this final point, trust, is really critical. Those relationships need to be established well in advance of a large event. One of the things that we've started to talk to the UN, various branches of the UN, and also to DFID about, is a potential role for science advisory groups. In other words, making links between scientists and stakeholders, scientists and practitioners, before the event happens, so that you have a phone number to call or you have an email address, even if it's simply to say, what's going to happen next? What should we plan for? What are the next 24 hours going to bring? The next 48 hours, the next 72 hours, etc. In terms of where we're going next in the department, we've had a fun project just funded by DFID to look at landslide mapping over the 2015, 16, 17, and 18 monsoons to see how this hazard is evolving. Surprisingly, that's not something that we have a good physical understanding of, even though we've seen this persistent landslide hazard in previous earthquakes. So that's just beginning. And we also have a cohort of students, 4 PhD students shown here on the right-hand side of the slide. The funding for their projects comes from the Chancellor's Appeal from 2015-16, which was focused on hazard. And in particular, that some of that then went into what's called the Action on Natural Disasters, this focused PhD program. And all 4 of these students are working on aspects of landsliding in Nepal, from simple rules that communities can use to the impacts of landslides on road construction, and to the new ways of seeing the landslide hazard after an earthquake, irrespective of things like cloud cover. So we'll see what they come up with. So I'll leave it at that. I'm very happy to take any questions, but thank you very much for your time and for your attention.